When I was a kid, I had this recurring nightmare that always preceded the death of a loved one. It wasn't quite a premonition. I didn't know who was going to die, how they would die or when. Only that it would be within the next few days to a week. I had the dream a few times before I figured out the link between the dream and the deaths. These were ordinary deaths. Elderly relatives, my grandfather's terminal cancer, my aunt who lost a child during preterm labor. I grieved for each lost loved one. The dream was short. It took place in this massive white room, so big that I couldn't see the walls. Maybe there weren't any walls. It was like I was looking through a rip in reality. More like I was seeing behind the fabric of the reality we live in. Seeing the machine that operates our universe. I say machine because it felt so cold, so mechanical. In the vast nothingness of all white, I would see this gray, not quite steel cable, extending as far as the eye could see. On the cable was a massive black sphere. No light reflected off of this sphere. In this too bright white plane, the sphere was impossibly dark, as if it absorbed any light. The sphere would move swiftly along this cable until suddenly the rest of the cable would just vanish and the sphere would stop instantly without any slowing. Then a wall would appear, a too bright white wall that was indistinguishable from the rest of the too bright whiteness. But I would know that it was there. On the wall, a name was printed. At least, I always assumed it was a name. I could never picture it after I woke up. This wall would only stay up for a split second, but it was an eternity. Everything around me would evaporate, and I'd have this feeling in my entire body that was a combination of pure weightlessness, the feeling you get when you're about to fall, and utter consuming dread. In that split second, something, someone, ended. This was an absolute ending. There's no afterlife, no heaven or hell. After the certainty of this mechanism, I would wake up gasping, crying, completely disoriented. The first time I remember having this dream, I was 7, although it was already familiar to me then, so I'm sure I was even younger when it first started. I was raised Catholic and was actually pretty religious when I was a kid. This dream was the antithesis of my entire religion. I tried to ignore it at first, tried to forget about the dream. And I had the dream a couple of more times after that. When I was 9, I had it 3 nights in a row. Then my great-grandma passed away, and that night was dream-free. I realized what it meant. I tried talking to my parents about it. They chalked it up to grief and an overactive imagination. I tried talking to a school counselor about it. She talked to my parents. My parents were going through a rough patch, made worse by having to foster and provide for 3 of my cousins, plus my brother and I. I overheard things like seeking attention, acting out. Maybe she got it from one of her books. Needs more socialization. I tried talking to our church's priest about it too, who seemed very skeptical and just told me to have faith in God and pray more. After that, I learned my lesson and stopped talking about it. The dream came again when I was 10, and I guessed correctly that it was my grandfather, who had been ill for some time with terminal brain cancer. I convinced my dad that they should go and see him that weekend. He lived a couple away from us with his wife. My grandpa passed that night after they arrived. I tried researching the dream, but unlike the movies, neither our school library nor our public library had many books about premonitions, the afterlife, aside from biblical texts, or anything supernatural. The internet wasn't helpful either. This was the 90s, and not surprisingly, it's hard to come up with the relevant results for something like big black ball precognitive dream death. I did pick up dream interpretation as a hobby, and because of all that time I spent digging into dream symbols, I'm pretty good at interpreting other people's dreams. I had the dream again when I was 11, great-grandma. Then again when I was 13. This time the dream started nightly on September 4th, 2001. By the next week, I was very paranoid and freaking my parents out, mostly because I kept urging them to be careful and telling them that I loved them approximately 100 times a day. They kept asking me what was wrong, but I didn't think that they'd believe me, so I didn't tell them. September 11th, 2001 happened, and I didn't have the dream that night. I didn't lose anyone close to me in the attacks, but it was a tragedy felt by the entire nation. The next day, my mother asked me why I had been so weird all week, and all I told her was that I had a dream, that I knew something bad was going to happen, but I didn't know who it was going to happen to or when. She didn't say anything after that, but I got the feeling that she believed me and was a little scared of it. I was just shy of my 14th birthday when the dream started coming again. I also had the flu, running a fever, so I'm not sure if that affected me and made me a little delusional. But I spent about a week feeling like I wasn't sure if I was dreaming or not, even though I was awake. 2 nights before my birthday, my fever peaked, and I went to bed early. The dreams were intense, alternating between my recurring dream and other creepy black and white dreams that I've never been able to remember. What I do remember is sleepwalking. I've always been a sleep talker, but this is the only time I've ever sleepwalked. And I have lucid dreams quite often, where I'm able to change the dream that I'm in and remember it. But this was completely different. I wasn't in control of myself. I knew I was dreaming, but I was trapped inside myself, a spectator, helplessly watching as I walked around. My house was different too. The blinds and curtains were gone from the windows, and instead of the street lamps and lawns outside, there was just black. A flash of light similar to lightning would go off and light up the blackness for a split second, but there was no ground, nothing to light up. The inside of the house was stripped bare, down to just the beds. No other furniture, no clothes, toys, towels, anything else that you normally would see lying around a house. Everything was black and white, except the people, my family. I walked around in my sleep, not in control but fully aware of what was going on, checking on all of my family members to see if they were alive. Once I had checked on all of them, I looked out this big window at the landing of the stairs, and when the lightning-like flash went off, I glimpsed the familiar cable and giant sphere in the distance. I felt this cold, unforgiving, omnipotent presence behind me at the bottom of the stairs, and I knew that I had been found. Something new that I had seen behind the curtain, had seen the mechanics operating our world, and it was here to fix that problem. I turned to face it. The next thing I knew, it was morning. The sun was shining through the blinds of my bedroom window. Birds were chirping outside. I'm not being dramatic, I remember this very clearly. And I was lying in bed. I felt great. My fever was gone, and the flu that had had me in bed for a week had disappeared overnight. It was a beautiful morning, the stuff of fairy tales, minus the singing birds and animals that help with chores. And I was utterly confused by it, because it seemed like a second ago I had been nearly face to face with something that didn't want me peeking behind that rip in reality. I was still filled with such dread, and I rushed downstairs to find my mom to ask if everyone was okay. And now that I think about it, I should probably apologize to my mom for that morning, because I'm sure I scared the hell out of her. The day before, I was so sick that I couldn't keep any food down, and I had to alternate Tylenol and ibuprofen just to keep my fever below 104. Then that morning I was running around looking much better, with the exception of being obviously scared and asking if everyone was okay. Everyone was fine. Everything was fine. But someone was still going to die, and I had no idea who. I spent the day frustrated and scared because I was powerless to stop whatever was going to happen. And even though that presence was gone, there's not really a guarantee when it comes to forces that are far beyond mortal comprehension. I tried not to think about the sleepwalking. I was in no way ready to begin to wonder what happened there. No dreams that night, and I slept great. But I awoke with a heavy heart, because I knew what it meant. It was my birthday, but I was not celebrating. Around 5 p.m. that day, my mom came into my room and sat in my bed by me. She was trying to hold back sobs, as she told me that a friend of mine was in his parents' van, with his dad driving, his mom in the front seat, and his sister sitting next to him. Heading into town the night before, for some reason, they think maybe an animal ran into the road. The van swerved and went off the side of the road, flipped upside down, and landed in the river. Several hours later, someone was driving by and saw frost on a tire that was barely sticking out of the water and called it in. The family had all drowned. It took me years to find an uneasy peace with what had happened. I felt such guilt, like I could have prevented it, like I could have stopped any of it. Losing my friend and his family was devastating to me. They were wonderful people. And although my friend and I were young, we could have been more than just friends eventually. I never had the dream again. I've tried again and again to make some sense of it, but I've never really found anything close to what I experienced. I know I didn't cause any of these deaths, that I was just someone who, either by chance or for unknown reason, saw through this immersive illusion we call reality, and got a glimpse into the mechanism behind it. I don't feel like I was punished by the presence I felt. I think I simply closed up that rift that I was seeing through. I still don't understand any of it. I don't think we're able to understand. We just aren't meant to. Mr. Katzen had been sitting up at the bar for some time. The lights and the music were both very low, casting a sort of malaise over the entire half-empty room. A group of men in the corner were watching a baseball game on the television on the wall. A few small groups of people murmured among themselves at the tables. Katzen had been staring into several glasses of bourbon for the past 2 hours. The room around him slowly fading into a dull blur of colors and sounds. The girl tending bar just replaced his glass when it ran dry, and the cycle continued. It was around midnight when the stranger approached him. Katzen turned to see a middle-aged man sitting in the stool to the left of him. The man seemed to be the only thing in the room, not covered in the haze of inebriation. He didn't wave to the bartender, nor did the bartender seem to see him. He merely turned and looked directly into Cadson's eyes. The stranger was nondescript for the most part, except for the eyes. They were bright gold, shining in the dim light. Cadson had never seen anything quite like them. When the man talked, his voice was low and smooth, like a storm in the distance. "Hello, Mr. Cadson," said the man. "I'm Death." Cadson believed him. No amount of liquor led him to that belief. It was more of an instinct, that a man should know death when it stood before him. "Pleasure to meet you," said Cadson, deciding that being polite was the correct option. "Can I buy you around?" Death laughed. It was a fake laugh, although a very good one. It sounded like someone that has already heard every joke in the world 1,000 times, but is still trying to be polite. "I don't drink, I'm afraid," said Death. "I'm just here to tell you that you'll be throwing in the towel somewhat earlier than you would expect." "Oh yeah? And why do I get a heads up?" asked Cadson. He grabbed several nuts out of a bowl in front of him. They had been the only thing he'd eaten in half a day. Death leaned up onto the bar, folding his hands under his chin. Death sighed deeply, as if he didn't want to hear the question. "Because, Mr. Cadson," said Death, "I've begun doing contract work." "Successful guy like you?" asked Cadson. "Didn't think you'd need the extra cash." He looked over at Death, only to find the seat empty. He considered for the first time that he was merely hallucinating. Someone to his right coughed lightly. Cadson turned to find an old woman looking at him with the same pair of gold eyes. "I merely take a small something from the people that require my services," said the more elderly Death. "Although I can't say it's all for that. What do I need with a memory or a sliver of a man's soul? After sticking to the script for millions of years, it's mainly about the thrill, and I enjoy the conversation." Death smiled, showing a mouthful of yellowed dentures. "You still didn't really answer the question," said Cadson. Death stopped smiling quite so broadly. "Very perceptive for someone on their 6th drink," said Death, "which makes this all the more fun." Death disappeared from the seat. Cadson swung around to find an athletic-looking young man to his left. The gold eyes seemed to pierce him even deeper. "A question is an amazing thing, Mr. Cadson. The first thing a mortal does upon being born is wonder. Upon waking up, entering a room, meeting someone, or even looking up into the sky, the first thing you do is wonder. Immortals don't wonder. They know." The longing in Death's voice was half heartbreaking and half terrifying. "If you're going off script, they don't know, do they?" asked Cadson. His head was beginning to clear, as adrenaline and fear began to sweep away the haze. Death chuckled. "No, they don't," said Death, "and that terrifies them." "Who's them?" "That's something I can't answer," said Death. "There are rules, you see. I can do this as long as everyone follows the rules. The rules you have to worry about say that dead men have certain rights. Most come by them naturally. But when I take a more active role, I'm required to tell you those rights, hence my presence here." Death gestured back at the darkened, half-empty bar. "Okay, what rights do I have?" Death vanished again, and reappeared as a young boy on the other side of Cadson. The eon-old eyes were much more disturbing on a 10-year-old's face. "This is the first right of knowledge," said Death in a high-pitched voice. "All men are entitled to know the manner of their death prior to its occurrence." "You're saying everyone knows how they're going to die?" "If anyone pays close enough attention to their life," said Death, "they'll know. Slow and painful, or short and violent. They can all see it coming if they try. I've never seen anyone really try, though. You, though, Mr. Katzen, are going to die choking on one of those peanuts you've been eating." Katzen stopped his hand as he was about to put another nut into his mouth, placed it back into the bowl and pushed it away. "That won't change anything, but if it makes you feel better, I suppose." "And why do you have to tell me?" "Rules," said Death. "If someone isn't given full rights, shit happens." Katzen almost laughed, hearing the kid version of Death say that, but stifled it. "Which brings us to your second right, the right of choice. There are many, many things that can happen after you die, and people always choose for themselves what happens to them. They don't even know they're doing it, but they do it." "And I get to choose?" asked Katzen. "Do I get to know what the choices are?" "Believe me, Mr. Katzen." The child disappeared. Katzen turned to see a beautiful woman to his left. In fact, she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. He hoped Death would stay that way for a while. "My job would be so much simpler if I could tell people the options. But don't worry. You'll choose before you die. Which brings me to your last right, and the main reason I'm here. The right of experience." "I've got plenty of experience," said Katzen, taking another swig of bourbon. "Believe me." "But not enough," said Death. The woman's voice was light and sensual, a hint of an unknown accent. Katzen tried to keep from looking at Death while it spoke. He worried that he might get distracted. A mortal's experiences are why it knows its death and why it makes its choices. Without those experiences, the system falls apart. So I'm here to impart knowledge to make up for what you're going to lose." "So we're having a Q&A session now?" asked Katzen. "More or less," said Death. "Starting now, you will have 4 questions. I will have to tell you the complete truth about anything you ask, but there are certain things I cannot talk about. If you ask about those, you forfeit 1 question." "And what are those?" asked Katzen. It took him less than a second to realize what he had done. He looked up into Death's eyes and saw a slight triumph there. "1 question down," said Death. "Don't feel bad. They all do that. I had one man that used all 4 in about 10 seconds. So you're still ahead of the game. In any case, you cannot ask about what happens after you die, anything that will happen in the future, or how to live forever, and that's it." Katzen realized something that he hadn't up until this point. This was a game to Death. A game that it thoroughly enjoyed. That was its payout. "So I assume you'll be thinking more carefully about the next 3. Death gave him a coy look that would have made any man fall in love. He realized exactly why it had waited until that point to take that form. But any alcohol in his system had been dissolved by pure fear at that point. These were perhaps his final chances to do anything with his pathetic life. "Who sent you to kill me?" asked Katzen, slowly and deliberately. Death smiled. Mr. Holland, your business partner, said Death. Katzen began to ask why, but slapped his hand over his mouth before the sound came out. Death laughed. You know what? It asked. You caught that so well, I'm going to tell you why just for the hell of it. He found those certain files you didn't want him to. The ones about the offshore accounts and the shady practices. He was most interested in the files you were planning to frame and blackmail him with. Katzen stared down into his glass, but said nothing. People don't actually hire me consciously. It's more a matter of mindset. How much they want someone dead and how much they're willing to sacrifice. Mr. Holland, for instance, can no longer remember 1991, the happiest year of his life. That's the year he got his master's degree, met his wife, and had the best steak he'd ever eaten. To you, it may not seem like much, but trust me, if he knew, he would not have agreed. So what's next? Several thoughts went through Katzen's head at that moment. He wondered where his life went wrong. He wondered if there was any chance at all he was going to get into any sort of heaven. He wondered if he really had known it was going to end this way. I know this is important, Mr. Katzen, but I do have places to be. There was a hint of impatience in Death's voice that made a single thought arise in Katzen's head. It was almost like Death was worried. Katzen thought about it more, making sure his question was perfect, and praying he was right. Death stared in rapt attention as he opened his lips. You have places to be, and I have rights. Is that a question? Asked Death, a look of confusion appearing on its face. Hope surged into Katzen. Not at all, he said. If I don't ask you the last question, and my rights are not fulfilled, that means you can't kill me early because shit happens, right? Death cocked its head to the side, a calculating expression on its face. Its golden eyes stared right through Katzen as it sat there and thought. Finally, a wide grin spread over Death's face. It let out the lightest, most wonderful laugh that Katzen had ever heard. That's correct, Mr. Katzen, said Death, leaning in close. But have you weighed the possibilities? You may be scheduled to die tomorrow. Isn't there some answer you would be willing to give up for a day? Can you live knowing that you traded away the chance? Death paused for a moment. And won't Mr. Holland be very much trouble for you shortly? I'll deal with it, said Katzen. He turned away from Death and went back to sipping on his bourbon. Good night, miss. Death sighed and got up from the bar stool. It laid one hand on Katzen's shoulder and lowered its lips to his ear, despite Katzen's suspicion that no one else could hear it. Not many have made it this far into the game, Mr. Katzen. Congratulations. But I want you to know that I always get my man. I've gotten every one of them in human history, in fact. I'll see you soon. Death smiled once more and walked away toward the door. As Katzen watched from the corner of his eye, the figure disappeared halfway across the room. He made a silent toast and drained the remainder of his glass. As he slammed it back onto the bar top, the bartender walked over to him. Can I get another bourbon? Asked Katzen. The bartender looked at his watch. I think you've got time for one more, said the bartender. While the bartender poured the drink, Katzen looked back at the room and wondered if the people knew what had just happened, if it had in fact happened. The bartender put the drink down in front of him. On the house, in fact, he said with a smile before walking away. "Thank you," muttered Katzen, his mind elsewhere. As he took the first sip of his drink, he absent-mindedly reached for the bowl of nuts. The general span for FM radio stations usually falls in the range of 79 to 108. AM stations generally fall in the range of 530 to 1750. Within these frequencies, 99.9% of audible radio lives. In these parameters, you will find talk radio, rock, rap, country, etc. Because basically everything you'd generally associate with radio. Outside these areas were military stations used during the wars and some rogue stations that have all been since shut down or discontinued. Those areas are known as dark frequencies, or dark radio. No one with specialized radios have heard anything on dark radio stations in years. Until now. One day a man came home from the flea market with a highly sensitive military-grade frequency radio. His wife thought it was a worthless piece of crap, but the husband, being a huge history buff, thought it was a wise investment. He had hoped to find an active military station, or one that was set up on a constant loop broadcasting Soviet-era information, or war propaganda. He would spend hours a day scanning for stations and hoping he could find something out there that would make this purchase worthwhile. He would pick one precise frequency at a time and scan the entire range for any activity. Several days went by digging through static, and he had nothing to show for it. Until the day he finally heard something. It was grainy at first. He tried to fine-tune it as best as possible, but he was barely able to make out what was being said. He could hear words, but was unable to understand them. He went out the next day and bought a sound recorder. When he turned on the radio, he was shocked how much clearer the signal came in. It was still grainy, but he could make out some of it. In a low groan, he heard, We have what? The man thought to himself. The possibilities were endless. The man noticed that the words kept repeating on a loop. He had found exactly what he was looking for. An old, abandoned loop station. He turned on the recorder and tried to record the sound as best he could. The next day, he was going to take it to a studio and see if they could find out exactly what was being said. The man barely got any sleep that night. He was filled with excitement about making such a historical discovery and the world-changing effect it could possibly have. He figured it would be best not to tell his wife about the discovery until he knew for sure what it was. Before he left the house that morning, he turned on the radio again. He set the recorder down when he realized he wouldn't need it. The station was now a lot clearer, with minimal static. It was as if the station was reaching out to his radio. We have 21. Followed by the sound of two bells, one high-pitched and one low-pitched. The man sat in awe, listening to the loop over and over again. We have 21. We have 21. We have 21. He would hear the two bells in between each repeating phrase. 21, is that a code for something? Do they have 21 objects of some sort? He was perplexed. He spent the day doing research, but he ended up with nothing. Not to mention of the phrase, we have 21. if it played any significance in history. He waited a day hoping the signal would improve in case there was something he couldn't hear yet. When he turned the radio on the next day, he was disappointed to hear the same voice repeating the same phrase over and over with the 2 bells in between. Although something seemed different. It took him a few minutes to realize, but a faint clicking was being heard in the background. It didn't take long for him to realize also that it was Morse code. He spent an hour on the computer translating it from scratch, and was thrilled to see that it spelled out coordinates. Using his GPS, he was able to find the location. It was about a 2-hour drive from where he was. After driving down a few side roads and one really long deep into the woods, he had finally reached his destination. It was a large clearing, with a massive cube-shaped building in the center. It must have been at least 4 stories tall. All 4 sides were gray, with no marking on the outside as to what the building even was used for. He walked around the entire perimeter of the building and found the only door available. The door was surprisingly unlocked. He walked into the building and saw a giant empty room, dimly lit by dusty rooftop windows, and a single wooden desk and a chair in the middle. The place seemed like a giant airplane hangar from the inside. He approached the table and saw a small desk lamp illuminating radio broadcasting equipment, complete with a transmitter and a microphone. It was emitting a deep, ominous groaning noise. This makes no sense. There's no one here. Where's the sound coming from? He listened to the groan and noticed that it was changing sound, volume, and length. It didn't take him long to realize that it was exactly saying, "We have 21," extremely slowly. He listened for several minutes until the groaning voice stopped after completing the phrase. None of this made any sense to him. Who was saying this? There's no one here. Why is it so slow? And why is it now silent and not repeating? And where are the bell? At that moment, 2 deafeningly loud bells rang throughout the room. They didn't sound like small bells anymore. They sounded like massive church bells being struck with a sledgehammer just inches above his head. He covered his ears and collapsed to the ground. When the sound finally stopped, he uncovered his ears, looked around the building again. He noticed it was significantly darker than before. The windows on the roof were no more. There was no door, nor was there even a sign of one existing. The lamp on the desk was still lit, and all the broadcasting equipment was still there. He was now surrounded by silence and darkness. Curiosity eventually got the best of his wife later that day. She turned on her husband's radio, clear as day, as if he were standing right there in the room. She heard his voice. "We have 22. It was silent for a brief moment. Then, static.